Walk Two Moons, Chapter 42, The Bus and the Willow. When the man drove off, I crawled beneath the railing and made my way down the hill toward the bus. In the east, the sky was smoky gray, and I was glad for the approaching dawn. In the year and a half since the trail was hacked out, the brush had begun to grow back. Wet with dew, straggly branches slapped and scratched at my legs and hid uneven ground, so that several times I tripped, tumbling and sliding downward. The bus lay on its side like an old sick horse, its broken headlights staring out mournfully into the surrounding trees. Most of the huge rubber tires were punctured and grotesquely twisted on their axles. I climbed up onto the bus's side, hoping to make my way down to an open window, but there were two enormous gashes torn into the side, and the jagged metal was peeled back like a sardine tin. Through a smashed window behind the driver's seat, I saw a jumbled mess of twisted seats and chunks of foam rubber. Everything was dusted over with fuzzy green mold. I had imagined that I would drop through a window and walk down the aisle, but there was no space inside to move. I had wanted to scour every inch of the bus, looking for something, anything that might be familiar. By now, the sky was pale pink, and it was easier to find the uphill trail, but harder going as it was a steep incline. By the time I reached the top, I was muddy and scratched from head to toe. It wasn't until I had crawled beneath the railing that I noticed the car parked behind Gramps' red Chevrolet. It was the sheriff. He was talking on his radio when he saw me, and he motioned for his deputy to get out. The deputy said, "We were just about to come down there after you. We saw you up on top of the bus. You kids ought to know better. What were you doing down there at this time of day anyway?" Before I could answer, the sheriff climbed out of his car. He settled his hat on his head and shifted his holster. "Where are the others?" he said. "There aren't any others," I said. "Who brought you up here?" "I brought myself." "Whose car is this?" "My grandfather's." "And where is he?" The sheriff glanced to the left and to the right as if Gramps might be hiding in the bushes. "He's in Coeur d'Alene," the sheriff said. "Pardon?" So I told him about Graham and about how Gramps had to stay with her and how I had driven from Coeur d'Alene very carefully. The sheriff said, "Now let me get this straight." And he repeated everything I said, ending with, "And you're telling me that you drove from Coeur d'Alene to this spot on this hill all by yourself?" "Very carefully," I said. "My Gramps taught me how to drive, and he taught me to drive very carefully." The sheriff said to the deputy, "I'm afraid to ask this young lady exactly how old she is. Why don't you ask her?" The deputy said, "How old are you?" I told him. The sheriff gave me a stern look and said, "I don't suppose you would mind telling me exactly what was so all-fired important that you couldn't wait for someone with a legitimate driver's license to bring you to the fair city of Lewiston. And so I told him all the rest. When I had finished, he returned to his car and talked into the radio some more. Then he told me to get in his car, and he told the deputy to follow in Gramps' car. I thought the sheriff was probably going to put me in jail, and it wasn't the thought of jail that bothered me so much. It was knowing that I was this close and might not be able to do what I had come to do, and it was knowing that I needed to get back to Graham. He did not take me to jail, however. He drove me across the bridge into Lewiston and through the city and up a hill. He drove into Longwood, stopped at the caretaker's house, and went inside. Behind us was the deputy in Gramps' car. The caretaker came out and pointed off to the right, and the sheriff got back in the car and drove off in that direction. It was a pleasant place. The Snake River curved behind this section, and tall, full-leaved trees grew here and there across the lawn. The sheriff parked the car and led me up a path toward the river. There, on a little hill overlooking the river and the valley, was my mother's grave. On the tombstone, beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death, was an engraving of a maple tree. It was only then, when I saw the stone and her name, Chanhassen, Sugar, Pickford Hiddle, and the engraving of the tree, that I knew, by myself and for myself, that she was not coming back. I asked if I could sit there for a little while because I wanted to memorize the place. I wanted to memorize the grass and the trees, the smells and the sounds. In the midst of the still morning, with only the sound of the river gurgling by, I heard a bird. It was singing a bird song, a true, sweet bird song. I looked all around and then up into the willow that leaned toward the river. The bird song came from the top of the willow, and I did not want to look too closely because I wanted it to be the tree that was singing. I kissed the willow. "Happy birthday," I said. In the sheriff's car, I said, "She isn't actually gone at all. She's singing in the trees." "Whatever you say, Miss Salmonaka Hiddle. You can take me to jail now." Chapter 43, Our Gooseberry. Instead of taking me to jail, the sheriff drove me to Coeur d'Alene with the deputy following us in Graham's car. The sheriff gave me a lengthy and severe lecture about driving without a license, and he made me promise that I would not drive again until I was 16. "Not even on Graham's farm?" I said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "I suppose people are going to do whatever they want to on their own farms," he said, "as long as they have a lot of room to maneuver and as long as they are not endangering the lives of any other persons or animals. But I'm not saying you ought to. I'm not giving you permission or anything." I asked him to tell me about the bus accident. When I asked him if he had been there that night, and if he had seen anyone brought out of the bus, he said, "You don't want to know all that. A person shouldn't have to think about those things." "Did you see my mother?" "I saw a lot of people, Salmonaka, and maybe I saw your mother and maybe I didn't. But I'm sorry to say that if I did see her, I didn't know it. I remember your father coming into the station. I do remember that. But I wasn't with him. I wasn't with him. I wasn't there when—" "Did you see Mrs. Cadaver?" I said. "How do you know about Mrs. Cadaver?" he said. "Of course I saw Mrs. Cadaver. Everyone saw Mrs. Cadaver. 9 hours after the bus rolled over, as all those stretchers were being carried up the hill, and everyone despairing, there was her hand coming up out of the window, and everyone was shouting because there it was, a moving hand." He glanced at me. "I wish it had been your mother's hand." "Mrs. Cadaver was sitting next to my mother," I said. "Oh." "They were strangers to each other when they got on the bus, but by the time they got off, 6 days later, they were friends. My mother told Mrs. Cadaver all about me and my father and our farm in Bybanks. She told Mrs. Cadaver about the fields and the blackberries and Moody Blue and the chickens and the singing tree. I think that if she told Mrs. Cadaver all that, then my mother must have been missing us, don't you think?" I'm sure of it, the sheriff said. And how do you know all this? So I explained to him how Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this on the day Phoebe's mother returned. Mrs. Cadaver told me about how my father visited her in the hospital in Lewiston after he had buried my mother. He came to see the only survivor from the bus crash. And when he learned that Mrs. Cadaver had been sitting next to my mother, they started talking about her. They talked for 6 hours. Mrs. Cadaver told me about her and my father writing to each other and about how my father needed to get away from Bybanks for a while. I asked Mrs. Cadaver why my father hadn't told me how he met her, and she said he had tried, but I didn't want to hear it, and he didn't want to upset me. He thought I might dislike Margaret because she had survived and my mother had not. Do you love him? I had asked Mrs. Cadaver. Are you going to marry him? Goodness, she said. It's a little early for that. He's all holding on to me because I was with your mother and held her hand in the last moments. Your father isn't ready to love anyone else yet. Your mother was one of a kind. That's true, she was. And even though Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this and told me how she had been with my mother in her last minutes, I still do not believe that my mother was actually dead. Did not believe that my mother was actually dead. I still thought that there might have been a mistake. I don't know what I had hoped to find in Lewiston. Maybe I had expected that I would see her walking through a field, and I would call to her and she would say, "Oh, Salmanaka, my left arm," and "Oh, Salmanaka, take me home." I slept for the last 50 miles to Coeur d'Alene, and when I awoke, I was sitting in the sheriff's car outside the hospital entrance. The sheriff was coming out of the hospital. He handed me an envelope and slid in beside me on the seat. The envelope was a note from Gramps giving the name of the motel he was staying at. Beneath that he had written, I am sorry to say that our gooseberry died at 3 o'clock this morning. Gramps was sitting on the side of the bed in the motel, talking on the telephone, when he saw me and the sheriff at the door. He put the phone down and hugged me to it. The sheriff told Gramps how sorry he was and that he didn't think it was the time or place to give anybody a lecture about underage granddaughters driving down a mountainside in the middle of the night. He handed Gramps his car key and asked Gramps if he needed help making any arrangements. Gramps said he had taken care of most things. Graham's body was being flown back to Bybanks, where my father would meet the plane. Gramps and I were going to finish what had to be done in Coeur d'Alene and leave the next morning. After the sheriff and his deputy left, I noticed Graham's and Gramps' open suitcase. Inside were Graham's things, all mixed in with Gramps' clothes. I picked up her baby powder and smelled it. On the desk was a crumpled letter. When Gramps saw me look at it, he said, "I wrote her a letter last night. It's a love letter." Gramps lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. "Chickabiddy," he said, "I miss my gooseberry." He put one arm over his eyes. His other hand patted the empty space beside him. "This ain't," he said. "This ain't." "It's okay," I said. I sat down on the other side of the bed and held his hand. "This ain't your marriage bed." About 5 minutes later, Gramps cleared his throat and said, "But it will have to do."